All right, guys, we are back. Hey, Pete, what's going on, man?
What's going on, Scott? Happy to be here.
So we are in week 2, episode 2 of our new show. Still working on a name. Some of the feedback from you guys was a little bit mixed bag, if I do say so myself. So we're going to see. I am going to throw it out there and see what you guys think. Pete and I thought Behind the Curtain might make a logical name as we pull the curtain back on some of the things that we deal with day to day in real estate. So let us know what you think. Behind the Curtain, could it possibly be our new name? But today on episode 2, what I want to talk to Pete about, and we're going to have a little bit more of a conversation. Last time I was talking about my story. Today is more just about focusing on, some of the things we see come up commonly in home inspections, and realizing that, every buyer and really every seller has different risk tolerances for what they're willing to take on from those inspections, things that are turned up during inspection. So Pete, why don't you lead it off? I know you've got a particular one in mind that recently came up, and kind of how there was a difference, with what your buyer was willing to take on versus what many other buyers might be willing to take on. So tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, man. So for sure. So first of all, definitely shoot us out a name. Let's get some ideas going. I like Behind the Curtain. It's definitely a lot better than two realtors, one house, or two guys, one house.
Yeah, two guys, one house. Come on.
That's not going to fly. But yeah, so like one thing that I learned through like just working with more and more buyers, right, is that everybody has a different like risk tolerance or pain tolerance when it comes to home items, right? Different things that come up in the inspection report. So what really triggered this was, I guess it was last week or 2 weeks ago, we had the home inspection report, and we found that there were asbestos tiles, floor tiles in the basement and 2 of the closets. Now, there's 2 schools of thought when it comes to asbestos, right? Someone who doesn't really know about asbestos just knows that it's a buzzword, right? And it's like scary, stay away from it, which not saying that there's no, it can be dangerous under certain circumstances. But anybody who's bought a house or lived through asbestos tile knows that, if you don't disturb it, right? If that asbestos tile is just sitting there, and I'm not an asbestos expert by any means, but from all the research I've done, if it's sitting there and it's not disturbed and what's the term, friable?
Yes. Yeah. And I think that's the important thing to pick up on, right? We aren't asbestos experts per se. So everything we're saying here is our opinion, but also just, you go through enough houses with enough buyers and you go through home inspections on enough homes, you realize, again, this is one of those items that I think it matters what someone's personal opinion is on it, more so, what are they comfortable with for them and their family. So let's hear more on, so what happens with this thing?
Yeah, so 100%. So, we're there. I'm explaining to them, in my experience with asbestos tiles, this is the deal. Home inspector tells them the same thing. Plenty of homes sell with asbestos tiles. Cover it. You're going to put flooring down anyway. Like, it's not an issue. Attorney, real estate attorneys deal with these things as well. So as I kind of reached a point where I asking myself, am I informing them or am I pushing them with something they're not comfortable with, right? And that was the big thing for me. And I was just like, listen, guys, like, if you're not comfortable with this, as long as you understand what it is, I want you to be my clients for life. It's not about this one sale. And I'm never going to push something that, is my opinion that you're not comfortable with. So what I kind of took away from that was really the realization that, like, everybody has a different risk tolerance, right? Some people will walk into an asbestos tile and they'll say, no big deal. Like, some people I've heard say, put on a respirator, a suit, and rip it out before anybody moves in. And
that is definitely not advice taken from Pete or Scott in this case, but yeah,
okay,
I have heard a few people talk about doing something like that. So,
but the more commonly thing is just cover it with flooring, right? But what I really want to take away is, like, listen, it's not for me to decide what you're comfortable with, no matter what it is, right? So that's really where I kind of made that, just had this idea to kind of talk about it.
Yeah, and I think it's something we've always got to be mindful of. I know, we've talked about this before, but like, when going back to my 2-family house that I bought, I bought this place with one of the 2 oil tanks remaining in the ground. It was an underground tank that was no longer in use. But that's a big risk item. A lot of people, a lot of attorneys would tell you, don't move forward unless the tank is out of the ground. Why are you taking that risk on as a buyer? I happen to have a really high tolerance for risk. So I worked out a credit that I felt like covered enough of my bases to make it worth me moving forward. And the seller, for different reasons, just was unwilling to move forward on pulling the tank. We took some precautions to make sure that, I was putting myself in the best possible position given the risk. And I had asbestos wrap pipe. I make sure I don't bang my head into it. And I know that it's one of those items, whether I go grab my respirator mask or, call in one of the great vendors that we work with to, remove that properly. I'll get it taken care of when I'm ready to, but I wanted to move forward. I saw, a great opportunity with this home, like we discussed last week. It's worked out pretty well for myself so far. So knock on wood. And I know when I'm working with clients, it's always right top of mind. What are you guys comfortable with? Talk to me about how you're feeling about this, right? Real estate.
Yeah, and that what was hard for me on this particular transaction was like, it was a house in a very specific area that we wanted to be in. The price was right. It checked off all the boxes. So that's where I found myself, right? Like, I'm trying to encourage them to really consider overlooking it and understand that it can be resolved with little to no risk. But at the same time, look, you've made it clear it's not, and a similar situation I had.
Well, wait,
clients.
1 second. Before we jump off that, I'm curious because, I think we're both really solution-based when it comes to our businesses and how we work with our clients. So I know that your clients weren't okay moving forward on the home with the asbestos tiles. What was the situation was the seller not willing to do anything to remediate?
So, I mean, again, that just, I think, comes into play the market right now, right? And again, when I say that, asbestos is not I don't want to say not a big deal, but a seller understands that majority of the public is willing to take this property with the asbestos tile without having to remove it. And I should also say alleged asbestos tile. There were no tests done or anything.
There we go. That's also an important note.
So, but yeah, I mean, I think in this market, if you're not comfortable with it, that's fine. And in a somewhat normal market and a house that's been sitting there for, a couple of weeks or months, you can work with that. And the seller is going to be more inclined to make some changes. But when they know that they can just, go back onto the market and get 5 more offers, you really don't have much leverage. And you really kind of have to pick your battles, so to speak. Because that was the other thing. The seller was working on some other things that needed to be addressed. So it was definitely a somewhat cooperative, reasonable seller from where we were standing. But, they were just like, look, we're not going to do all this because we don't feel we have to. And if I were representing the seller, I probably would have said the same thing.
Yeah. So now, I mean, we kind of touched on, and I know you were about to go into something there. So what did you have another example of, like one of these kind of, risk tolerant inspection items that pops up during the, course of a transaction?
So yeah, so this one was, again, and this kind of ties into why the buyer consultation in the beginning is so important, right? So we were looking in West Orange, super popular area where a lot of people want to be, right? Price points are higher. So once we started exploring that, getting beat out on stuff, we found this property that was really, it was in good shape, but it was dated, right? It really needed a lot of stuff. Did the home inspection, found things that the buyer really wasn't comfortable with, because this really was a DIY project, right? That's not what we were looking for, but that's what we ended up getting into. Long story short, they got nervous. They wanted to back out of the deal. The seller was offering them $15,000 to stay in the deal just so that they would be comfortable with it, right? So again, when we talk about what we're comfortable with versus what our clients are comfortable with, I'm looking at this saying $15,000. Do you know what you can do to this place? How much, but that's when I realized, like, they didn't sign up to buy a DIY. They thought it was a good idea because it was in the town and they were willing to do it. But when it came to the point of that much stuff, it just became too much for them and it was overwhelming. So we ended up shifting out of that market into another market where they're very happy now. So I love them
And that's
too.
awesome, man. And I think that's, something that separates. I know we've got some cool ideas for other things coming up in the, series here. And I know we're going to, I just want to touch on one thing here, though, is I think the big difference and what allows us to have these conversations with clients and make sure that we're truly reserving that role as their fiduciary in these situations, right? There is no wrong decision. We're here to guide them. We're here to, get them to the outcome that they want to see. Most often, we hope that is getting them into the home that they, put in an offer on. And yet there are these times where, right, a risk tolerance thing comes up that we realize it's just, not worth trying to shove the square peg into the round hole. And I always like to say to my clients, like, I'm in this for the long haul, and we're going to talk a little bit about like transactional realtors versus relationship-based realtors. And the last thing you want to do is put your client into a situation that they're going to regret long term, right? And so I think it's just really important to be mindful of, always checking in with your client, realizing that we can sit here and guide and, give case studies just like we did today of, here's a situation where I had a client, with an oil tank and it worked out okay. Here's, asbestos can work out okay. But at the end of the day, you got to have that comfort buy-in level from your client. And that's what's most important, I think, at the end of the day.
Yeah, man, 100%. I mean, there's been times where we've killed transactions and I've felt really bad about it. But then there's times where we've killed transactions and I've been like, thank God, because this was definitely worse than what we thought. So, to your point, we'll talk more about transactional versus relational, but I think it's super important. And you gain trust in somebody when you say, listen, you know what, you're right. And I support you on this, because it's not about us at the end of the day. It's about them.
Yeah. And I think, it's an important role that we play in their decision-making process to give them information, but ultimately let them make decisions, right? So I think any last notes you got on this one? Otherwise, we wrap up week 2, episode 2, and
no, I think that's pretty much it. 10 minutes is such a tight window. I think we're a little bit over again, but we hope that this gives you, a little bit of insight into what it's like to be us, and some of the challenges that we come across. And yeah, stay tuned for next week. We don't know what we're talking about yet, but I promise you it'll be fun.
Yeah, sounds good, guys. Till next week.
Later.